Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to our deep dive. Today, we're going to be kind of exploring excerpts from Adolf Hitler's rise to power and Donald Trump's political ascendancy. It's a dense topic for sure, but we'll unpack it together, I think, focusing on the parallels that the source draws between these two figures, and we'll be looking at the socio-political context, the strategies, and the rhetoric that define their ascents to power. It's important, I think, to acknowledge up front that we're dealing with vastly different historical situations and political systems, but even with those differences, the comparison, I think, offers some pretty striking insights.
Yeah, it's a lot like, I think, when you're holding two maps up side by side. The terrain may be different, but you start to notice like these similar paths, similar landmarks. So to really understand Hitler's trajectory, we need to go back in time to post-World War I Germany. And the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, this is really crucial here. It imposed really harsh reparations on Germany, and that led to economic turmoil. You had massive unemployment, a deep sense of national humiliation.
Yeah, it's like, imagine a country already reeling from defeat in war, right? And then on top of that, they're hit with these crippling economic penalties. I mean, that resentment, that feeling of being unfairly punished, it really created a breeding ground for extremist ideologies. And that's really where Hitler was able to step in.
He was a master at exploiting that kind of simmering anger, right? That simmering anger that was in the German people. He tapped into that collective yearning for a return to greatness. Restoration of German pride. He promised strength, unity, and a return to economic stability. And in a way, he offered a scapegoat for all these problems, the Allied powers, the Treaty of Versailles, and of course, his infamous targeting of minorities.
It's interesting to see how the source connects this to the rise of Donald Trump, though in a very different context, of course. I mean, the U.S. didn't lose a world war, but there were still these moments that really shook the nation's confidence and sort of triggered this widespread economic anxiety.
Exactly. Think about the 2008 financial crisis, right? This wasn't just like an economic meltdown. It was a blow to the American psyche. People lost homes, jobs, their faith in the system. There was this feeling that the American dream was slipping away. And that sense of vulnerability, well, that is definitely something that Trump expertly capitalized on.
Like Hitler, he positioned himself as the outsider, the one who could shake up the establishment and drain the swamp, as he put it. And his "Make America Great Again" slogan, that really resonated with people who felt left behind by things like globalization, technological change, and just the perceived failures of the political elite.
It was brilliant branding, really. Yeah, it really was. It tapped into that same yearning for a return to a perceived golden age, a time of strength and prosperity. Both Hitler and Trump, despite their very different backgrounds and contexts, both understood the power of nostalgia, the power of appealing to those deep-seated desires for security and national pride.
It's fascinating how they both navigated the political landscape to gain power. Hitler, he rose through the ranks of the Nazi Party, which was a fringe group at the time. He used his powerful oratory skills and charisma to connect with people who felt disillusioned and angry.
His early speeches were like rallies, almost revival meetings. He railed against the Treaty of Versailles, the weakness of the Weimar Republic, and the supposed enemies within Germany. He offered these very simple solutions to these very complex problems. He often scapegoated minorities and appealed to prejudice.
Trump's path was different. He was already a celebrity, known for his business dealings and his reality TV show, The Apprentice. He used that platform to cultivate an image of success and strength. And then he leveraged that image to enter the political arena.
His celebrity status gave him this instant name recognition and a built-in audience. He didn't have to climb the ranks of a political party. He already had his own stage. He had his own microphone. And he used it masterfully to tap into that same sense of national decline and frustration that Hitler exploited.
It is interesting how both figures, despite their vastly different backgrounds, kind of converged on these similar themes: nationalism, economic anxiety, and the promise of a return to greatness. They both understood how to connect with specific segments of the population that felt disenfranchised and disillusioned.
And they both understood how important it was to create a narrative, a story that resonated with their target audience. Hitler framed his narrative around restoring Germany to its rightful place in the world, purging it of weakness and what he perceived as internal enemies.
Trump's narrative was all about making America great again. It was about restoring its economic dominance, its global standing. And both narratives really appealed to emotion rather than logic, playing on fear, resentment, and a yearning for this, simpler, more glorious past.
And this is where the understanding of economic anxieties comes into sharp focus, right? The Great Depression in Germany, that played a crucial role in boosting the Nazi Party's popularity. The economic devastation, the widespread unemployment and poverty, well, it created a sense of desperation that Hitler really expertly exploited.
He promised jobs, economic stability, and a restoration of German pride. He presented himself as the only one who could lead the nation out of this crisis, the strong leader who would put Germany back on top.
Similarly, Trump capitalized on the economic anxieties that lingered after the 2008 financial crisis. He really targeted working-class voters who felt left behind by globalization, trade deals, and the perceived indifference of the political elite.
He promised to bring back jobs, renegotiate trade deals, and put America first, as he put it. His rhetoric really resonated with people who felt that the system had failed them, people who were just looking for someone to fight for their interests.
And this strategy proved effective in both cases. The promise of economic security, particularly in these times of widespread hardship, well, it resonated very deeply with voters who just felt vulnerable and disillusioned with the status quo.
It wasn't just about economic promises, though. Both Hitler and Trump were masters of propaganda and media manipulation. They understood the power of shaping the narrative, of controlling the information that reached the public.
In Hitler's case, we see the rise of a very sophisticated propaganda machine led by Joseph Goebbels. They used rallies, symbols like the swastika, these very powerful slogans, and emerging media like radio to create this very carefully crafted narrative that really presented Hitler as a savior figure.
They demonized their opponents, they spread misinformation, and they used fear and intimidation to silence dissent. They created a cult of personality around Hitler. They portrayed him as the infallible leader who would lead Germany to greatness.
Trump, operating in a completely different media landscape, really mastered the art of social media manipulation. He used Twitter to bypass traditional media outlets who often dismiss these outlets as fake news, and he used that platform to communicate directly with his supporters.
He used Twitter to spread his message, he used it to attack his critics, and to control the narrative. He created this direct line of communication with his base, bypassing the filters and fact-checking of traditional media.
Both figures, despite using very different media, understood the power of shaping public perception. They created these echo chambers where their supporters were bombarded with their message, and it reinforced their worldview and demonized any opposing viewpoints.
It's remarkable how they adapted to the media landscape of their respective times to really achieve this. Their mastery of propaganda and media manipulation was a key factor in their rise to power.
And that control over the narrative, well, it paved the way for them to consolidate power. It's a process that, again, involves similarities and some very stark differences. It's fascinating to see how they each navigated the existing political structures to secure their positions of authority.
In Hitler's case, we see this combination of political maneuvering and, tragically, the underestimation of his ambitions by these established political forces. By 1932, the Nazi Party was the largest in the Reichstag, but still lacked an outright majority.
And that's where the miscalculation of conservative politicians like Franz von Papen and President Hindenburg comes in. They believed they could use Hitler's popularity to stabilize the country while controlling him. And this led to his appointment as chancellor in 1933.
They thought they could use him as a pawn, but they underestimated his ruthlessness and his ability to exploit this system to his advantage. That appointment, intended to control him, ultimately gave him the foothold he needed to dismantle the Weimar Republic and establish his dictatorship.
Trump's path to power also involved navigating the complexities of the U.S. political system. His victory in the 2016 presidential election, despite losing the popular vote, really highlighted the unique role of the Electoral College.
His rise was initially met with skepticism, even within the Republican establishment. They, too, believed they could contain him and use his popularity for their own gain. But like the German conservatives with Hitler, they misjudged his willingness to upend norms and consolidate power within the party.
His control over the Republican Party became increasingly evident as he reshaped it in his image. He often marginalized those who disagreed with him. He demanded loyalty above all else, punishing those who dared to question him.
And this brings us to another crucial parallel: the use of emergencies and crises to really consolidate their hold on power. Both Hitler and Trump were masters at exploiting moments of fear and uncertainty to advance their agendas.
The Reichstag fire in 1933, this is a textbook example of this. The fire, which had destroyed the German parliament building, is still shrouded in mystery, regarding its origins. Some historians believe it was a genuine accident, while others suspect the Nazis themselves were responsible.
Yeah, regardless of who actually set the fire, Hitler definitely seized the opportunity. He used that incident to portray communists as this threat to national security. He created a climate of fear and essentially justified a crackdown on civil liberties.
He very quickly pushed through the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended freedom of speech, assembly, and the press. It allowed for warrantless arrests and detention without trial. Effectively, it was like dismantling the rule of law and paving the way for a totalitarian state.
It was a calculated move to eliminate opposition and consolidate power. Using the perception of this imminent threat to justify these authoritarian measures, Hitler understood that fear is such a powerful motivator. And he really used it masterfully to silence dissent and just consolidate his grip on power.
Trump, while operating in a completely different political and historical context, also exhibited, this tendency to kind of exploit crises for political gain. His handling of the COVID-19 pandemic is a prime example of this.
In the early days of the pandemic, he downplayed the severity of the virus, he dismissed expert advice, and he even spread misinformation about potential cures. He often prioritized his own political agenda over public health recommendations, undermining the efforts of public health officials and sowing confusion among the public.
He also used the pandemic to further his anti-immigration agenda, restricting travel from certain countries and blaming China for the spread of the virus. And, this rhetoric fueled xenophobia and division, exploiting the fear and uncertainty surrounding the pandemic for political gain.
And let's not forget the events surrounding the January 6th Capitol riot. In the aftermath of the 2020 election, Trump repeatedly made false claims of widespread voter fraud, essentially inciting his supporters to challenge the election results.
His rhetoric culminated in the January 6th attack on the Capitol, this shocking assault on American democracy that left 5 people dead and many injured. And, while he didn't explicitly instruct his supporters to storm the Capitol, his words and actions undoubtedly played a role in inciting the violence that occurred that day.
Both Hitler and Trump, though separated by time and circumstance, really exhibited this, shared understanding of how to exploit moments of crisis and uncertainty to strengthen their grip on power. It's a chilling reminder of how fragile democratic norms can be when faced with leaders who prioritize their own agendas above the well-being of their nation.
Their methods for eliminating rivals also differed significantly. Hitler, once in power, employed brute force to consolidate his authority. The Night of the Long Knives in 1934, this was a chilling example of his ruthlessness.
During this purge, Hitler ordered the assassination of his political opponents, including Ernst Röhm, who was the leader of the SA, the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing. Röhm had become such a powerful figure within the party, and Hitler saw him as a potential threat to his absolute authority.
The purge not only eliminated potential rivals, but it also sent this very clear message that any dissent or challenge to Hitler's leadership would be met with swift and brutal force. It was a turning point in the Nazi regime, solidifying Hitler's control over the party and the state.
Trump, operating within a democratic system with legal constraints, couldn't resort to such blatant acts of violence. However, he did display a pattern of sidelining or dismissing officials who dared to question his decisions or policies.
Figures like FBI Director James Comey and Attorney General Jeff Sessions were casualties of this approach. Comey was fired after he refused to pledge loyalty to Trump, while Sessions was repeatedly publicly humiliated and eventually forced to resign for accusing himself from the Russia investigation.
Trump demanded unwavering loyalty from those around him. He often prioritized it over competence or experience. This led to a high turnover rate within his administration, as those who disagreed with him or refused to bend to his will were quickly pushed out.
His endorsement of loyalist candidates in various elections further illustrates this strategy. He used his influence to support those who aligned with his agenda, often attacking and undermining those who dared to challenge him, even within his own party.
It's interesting to note how both figures, despite operating within these different systems and historical contexts, exhibited this shared tendency towards consolidating power by silencing dissenting voices. Whether through brute force or more subtle political maneuvers, they both sought to eliminate any potential challenges to their authority.
And this brings us to the crucial role of personality cults in their respective ascents. Hitler, after eliminating his rivals, fully embraced the image of this messianic leader, this infallible savior of Germany. And this image was carefully crafted through propaganda and reinforced by the brutal efficiency of the SS and the Gestapo.
The Nazi propaganda machine, it worked tirelessly to create a cult of personality around Hitler. They portrayed him as this charismatic leader, a brilliant strategist, and a man of the people. They used rallies, films, radio broadcasts, and newspapers to disseminate their message and shape public opinion.
They controlled the narrative, presenting Hitler as the only one who could save Germany from its enemies, both internal and external. They demonized their opponents, suppressed dissent, and really created this atmosphere of fear and intimidation, making it incredibly dangerous to question Hitler or any of his policies.
The Nuremberg rallies, these massive spectacles of carefully choreographed displays of power and adulation, further cemented this image of Hitler as an unchallengeable, almost godlike figure.
These rallies were carefully staged events. They were designed to evoke a sense of awe and inspire fanatical devotion to Hitler and the Nazi Party. The crowds, often numbering in the hundreds of thousands, they chanted slogans, saluted Hitler, and listened to his fiery speeches, mesmerized by his charisma and the spectacle of the event.
Trump, while operating within the constraints of a democratic system, also cultivated a cult of personality. His rallies were these very carefully staged events, designed to evoke this sense of fervent support and emotional connection with his base.
These rallies were often characterized by chants of "Make America Great Again," "Lock her up," and other slogans that demonized his opponents and tapped into the anger and resentment of his supporters. Trump himself would often speak for hours, railing against his perceived enemies, boasting about his accomplishments, and making promises that he often failed to keep.
The Make America Great Again slogan and its associated red caps became symbols of loyalty and belonging, creating this really powerful sense of identity among his supporters. It was more than just a slogan. It was like a badge of honor, a way to signal one's allegiance to Trump and his movement.
And this branding, combined with his constant attacks on the media as fake news, effectively demonized any opposing viewpoints as untrustworthy or even treasonous. He repeatedly undermined the credibility of legitimate news organizations. He accused them of bias and spreading lies, further solidifying his control over the narrative and reinforcing the belief among his supporters that they could only trust him as a source of information.
This tactic, reminiscent of Hitler's labeling of the press as Lügenpresse, lying press, serves to discredit any critical voices and solidify his control over the narrative. By attacking the media and portraying himself as the only source of truth, he created this information bubble where his supporters were increasingly isolated from alternative viewpoints and more susceptible to his propaganda.
The January 6th Capitol riot, fueled by his rhetoric and false claims of election fraud, tragically demonstrated the power of this cult of personality and the dangers it posed to democratic norms.
It really was. The riot, it was this culmination of years of Trump's rhetoric, his attacks on democratic institutions, and his cultivation of this cult or personality that really encouraged blind loyalty and violence against these perceived enemies. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of democracy and the dangers of unchecked power.
While it's crucial to acknowledge the parallels between Hitler and Trump's tactics, it's equally important to recognize the significant differences in their historical contexts and the consequences of their actions. Hitler's rise to power led to the horrors of the Holocaust, a systematic genocide that claimed the lives of millions of Jews and other minorities.
Right. Trump's presidency, while marked by, significant damage to democratic norms and institutions, it did not result in such catastrophic consequences. The checks and balances of the American political system, though tested, ultimately held firm. And that really prevented him from consolidating absolute power.
Senator Mark Kelly's characterization of Trump as a fascist, and John Bolton's concerns about Trump's admiration for authoritarian figures, well, that really highlights the alarm bells that were ringing. Even within his own party, they recognized the dangerous parallels between his tactics and those employed by dictators throughout history.
Their warnings, along with the widespread condemnation of the January 6th riot, serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance. In safeguarding democratic principles, it's a lesson we must heed, not just in the U.S., but in democracies around the world.
This comparative analysis of Hitler and Trump's ascents really offers valuable insights into the recurring patterns of how authoritarian tendencies can emerge and the strategies used to exploit vulnerabilities within a society. It underscores how important it is to understand history, recognizing those warning signs, and, actively engaging in civic discourse to protect democratic institutions.
It's about understanding the mechanisms of how seemingly fringe ideologies can gain traction, how these charismatic leaders can exploit fear and resentment to build a following, and how the erosion of democratic norms can happen so gradually, almost imperceptibly, until it's just too late.
The rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, I think, serves as a chilling example of how quickly a democracy can crumble. When faced with this combination of economic hardship, social division, and a charismatic leader who just skillfully exploits those vulnerabilities, it's a reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation and vigilance from all citizens.
The parallels with Trump, while less extreme in terms of outcomes, highlight the vulnerabilities that exist even within well-established democracies.
Yeah.
His attacks on the media, his attempts to undermine the legitimacy of elections, and his willingness to exploit divisions within society, it all points to this disregard for democratic norms. And that should concern us all.
It's a reminder that the threat to democracy doesn't always come in the form of a jackbooted dictator or a violent coup. It can also manifest in more subtle ways. Through the erosion of trust in institutions, the normalization of divisive rhetoric, and this gradual chipping away at the foundations of a free and open society.
So what can we learn from these historical and contemporary parallels to safeguard democratic institutions and prevent the rise of authoritarianism in the future? The source doesn't really offer any easy answers, but it does point to the importance of education, critical thinking, and active citizenship.
We must be vigilant in recognizing and challenging the tactics used to manipulate public opinion. Exploit fear and resentment and undermine democratic processes. It's a responsibility that falls on all of us, regardless of our political affiliations or ideologies.
Yeah. We need to be aware of the dangers of propaganda and misinformation and develop the critical thinking skills to discern fact from fiction. We need to engage in respectful dialogue with those who hold different views. Resist the urge to retreat into echo chambers where our own beliefs are constantly reinforced.
And we need to hold our leaders accountable. We need to demand transparency, integrity, and a commitment to democratic principles. We must resist any attempts to erode the rule of law, suppress dissent, or undermine the institutions that protect our freedoms.
The parallels between Hitler and Trump, though unsettling, offer these valuable lessons on the fragility of democracy and the constant need to defend it. It's a reminder that the fight for freedom and a just society is never truly over, but it's an ongoing process that requires our active participation and unwavering commitment to democratic values.
By understanding the patterns of the past, we can better equip ourselves to recognize and resist the threats to democracy that may emerge in the future. The future of our democracies may very well depend on it.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into such a complex and challenging topic. We hope this analysis has provided you with some valuable insights, and more importantly, a renewed sense of urgency in safeguarding those principles of democracy that we hold dear.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.